The forest had no name, at least none that anyone dared to speak aloud. It stood on the edge of the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow, a place where the sun seemed to shy away, casting long, skeletal shadows even at noon. The locals called it the Forest of Whispers, though no one could remember why. Perhaps it was the way the wind seemed to carry voices, soft, indistinct murmurs that coiled around the trees like serpents. Or perhaps it was the stories, passed down through generations, of those who entered and never returned. It was a place of silence and secrets, where the trees grew too close together, their gnarled branches twisting into a canopy so thick it choked out the sky. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves, though. No bird or beast ever seemed to stir. The forest was alive, but not in any way that could be explained. Elliot Carter had always been drawn to the unknown. A writer by trade, he thrived on the thrill of uncovering mysteries, and the Forest of Whispers was the ultimate enigma. He arrived in Black Hollow on a cold, gray afternoon, his car rattling down the narrow, potholed road that led into town. The locals eyed him with suspicion, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting to the forest as if it were listening. The town itself was a relic of a bygone era, its buildings weathered and crumbling, its streets empty save for the occasional stray dog or shuffling figure. The people of Black Hollow were a closed-off bunch, their lips sealed tight against outsiders. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations trailing off into uneasy silence whenever Elliot approached. "You don't want to go there," the old bartender warned him that night, his voice low and gravelly. He was a grizzled man with a face like cracked leather and eyes that seemed to see too much. No one comes back from the Forest of Whispers. Not whole, anyway. Elliot laughed it off, though the man's words sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard the stories of coarse tales of hikers who vanished, of children who wandered too close and were never seen again. But he didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He believed in logic, in reason. And yet, as he lay in his motel bed that night, the wind howling outside his window, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The next morning, Elliot set out for the forest. The air was thick with mist, and the trees loomed ahead like sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. He hesitated at the edge of the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he thought he heard something of faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves. He shook it off and stepped into the shadows. The forest was darker than he had imagined, the canopy above so dense that it felt like twilight even at midday. The ground was soft and spongy, littered with fallen leaves and twisted roots that seemed to reach for his ankles. He walked for what felt like hours, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. And then he heard it again, the whisper. It was faint at first, little more than a breath on the wind. But as he walked deeper into the forest, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice now, but many hundreds, maybe thousands all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a cacophony of sound. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate, pleading, filled with a sorrow so profound it made his chest ache. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it was deafening. And then, from somewhere deep within the forest, came a single, clear voice. "Leave." Elliot's heart raced as he turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. But the forest was a maze, every tree identical to the last, every path leading him in circles. He pulled out his compass, but the needle spun wildly, as if the very laws of nature had been upended. Panic began to set in, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. And then he saw Ite's shadow, darker than the rest, moving between the trees. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted like the branches of the trees. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head tilted at an angle that made Elliot's stomach churn. He froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The shadow stopped, its featureless face turning toward him. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come." Elliot stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. When he looked up, the shadow was gone, but the whispers had returned, louder now, more urgent. They swirled around him, pulling at his clothes, his hair, his skin. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside his head, a relentless, suffocating presence. Days passed, or maybe it was hours. Time had lost all meaning in the forest. Elliot wandered aimlessly, his mind fraying at the edges. The whispers were constant now, a never-ending chorus of voices that seemed to know his deepest fears, his darkest secrets. They taunted him, mocked him, begged him for release. He began to see things, shapes moving in the corner of his vision, faces staring out from the trees. They were familiar, these faces, though he couldn't place them. They were the faces of people he had known, people he had loved, their eyes hollow and accusing. And then there were the shadows, always just out of reach, always watching. He tried to retrace his steps, but the forest seemed to shift and change around him, the paths twisting and turning in on themselves. He was trapped, a prisoner in a labyrinth of nightmares. And the whispers, they were growing louder, more insistent, their words finally becoming clear. "Join us." Elliot's journey led him to a clearing, a place where the trees parted to reveal a circle of blackened earth. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bark cracked and oozing a thick, dark sap. The whispers were deafening here, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. And then he saw them, the shadows. They emerged from the trees, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes fixed on his, their mouths moving in unison with the whispers. "You are one of us now." Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, their cold, intangible hands gripping his arms, his legs, his throat. He felt himself being pulled into the tree, its bark splitting open to reveal a void of infinite darkness. The last thing he saw before the shadows consumed him was the face of the old bartender, his eyes filled with pity. Elliot's body was found weeks later, just outside the forest. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. The locals buried him quickly, without ceremony, and the forest was left undisturbed once more. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear the whispers. They drift through the trees, soft and insidious, calling to anyone who will listen. And if you're foolish enough to follow them, you'll find yourself in the heart of the forest, where the shadows move and the air is thick with the scent of decay. You'll hear the voices, 200s of them, maybe thousands all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a cacophony of sound. And then, just as you realize what they're saying, the shadows will close in, and the darkness will swallow you whole. Years later, another outsider arrives in Black Hollow, drawn by the legends of the Forest of Whispers. The locals watch in silence as the stranger steps into the shadows, their faces grim with the knowledge of what awaits. The wind picks up, carrying with it the faintest of whispers, and the forest stirs, ready to claim its next victim.